Hello again. So this is lesson number 8 and this is a highly opinionated video. So there's this disclaimer right in the start. If you don't like other people's opinion, then just close this browser and move on to another video, because I am going to share my opinion and it's about a really important topic that is close to your dear hearts. I know it, the test configuration. So the test configuration is different for everyone. That is why I have pointed to you the link to the test configuration in the documentation. If you want, just go and read that. But because you're over here, I'm going to share my knowledge, what I think is good for you, and what you need to do when you're building your own framework. So let's get started. Looking at the test configuration in the Playwright docs, you can see that the documentation is really good. I mean, there's literally no need to explain this video. If you just visit playwright.dev/docs/test configuration, it has got all the details. What I'm gonna do in this video is I'm gonna pick something like some interesting bits that I think are useful for most of the frameworks. The test configuration would be different for your framework. It would be tailored to your needs. Let's start and look at what the usual test configuration looks like. So when you set up a Playwright, like when you do a Playwright init on your local machine, this is what you get. So you see playwright.config.ts file, and it has got the test directory, which is pointing to the directory where your tests are. By default, the tests will run in parallel, and they're fully parallel. If you hover over it, you can see the definition of like Playwright test runs in parallel. In order to achieve it, it runs several workers. So if you want to run only one worker on one test at a time, you'll probably make that a false. Now, the only option, so if you remember the annotations video, we discussed about test.only. So if you enable this means basically the test.only will be disabled. I mean, your framework will fail if there's test.only committed to the code in the pipeline. So when the tests are running in the pipeline, it would say there's a failure. I cannot let you release this code because it has got test.only. So this is the configuration. Again, up to you. Maybe you need that test.only in the main branch, and maybe you don't. So it all depends on your particular scenario. Retries, how many retries do you want? How many workers do you want to run when you are in CI? And we can look at the reporters. So there are custom reporters. So I was looking at some of the other configurations. So there's, I think, Aaroh Playwright reporter, which was really standing out. And you could set it up by saying report in the Playwright configuration.ts file, the name of the reporter, or you could have like multiple reporters. You could pass it via command line. So you could potentially set it up that way. Now, so I'm going to come back to this use. Use is really important. So I'm going to go in detail about the use. Let's just go through the rest of the bits. So projects where you want to run, you can specify other browsers if you've got mobile. And you should always run your web server before you run the test. So this is what I'm going to enable if I need to run this on my local server. I mean, run these tests against my local server. So those are like things that are really like you already know about it if you're coming from a different framework. But if you look at test use options, this is where I found a bit of interest basically. So the same configuration that I showed you earlier on my machine, it covers everything over here in the basic configuration and the web server part. So it will make sure that it waits for the server. First of all, the test will start the server, so you don't have to do npm run start in the pipeline yourself. The test will do it for you, and it will check if the server already exists, if you want to reuse the existing server or do something else with it. So this is really important. And the other bit, the use. So in this configuration, it doesn't go in detail about what this use is. So on the left, you can see test use options. Test use options is covering this in a bit more detail. So if I were you, I would definitely set a base URL over here so I don't have to write the full URL. So if you look at the previous test that we wrote in the examples, I think it is in here. So we were always typing https playwright.dev. Now what if the URL is changing? What if we move from one domain to another? If what we have like multiple regions and all that. So base URL can change. So maybe you have a website called domain.co.uk, domain.com and domain.ie or something. This can be configured through your pipeline. So I would definitely put the base URL in the use. So how would you do it? Again, if you go to your test configuration, in this test configuration, you have this use. Here you can just enable the base URL and specify the base URL as playwright.dev, and then all the tests will be using the playwright.dev. Now, another thing that was really interesting, I think if you are like keen on building a framework and you have got a website which is behind the authentication, or you want to store something, store the state of the storage, you could potentially use storage.state. It populates a given storage. Again, it says useful for easy authentication. So if you look at the auth doc, this is really interesting. I would advise you to have a look at this documentation of authentication, and in future I will make some video on to cover this topic properly. Another thing I would definitely do, which I came across recently when I was implementing a production framework, was this expect. Let's see, I can find expect. Yes, so it is under the test configuration. So by default, you don't see this in the major configuration that comes with the init option of the framework. What I would do is I would add another object over here called expect. I'm just going to confirm. No, it wasn't there already, so I'm going to add expect and a timeout. And it says maximum amount of timeout it should be wait for. I think that there's, if you look at the documentation, if I search for expect timeout, this is a better way to do it. You could do it in here in the configuration like this. So this basically means 10 seconds because it's in milliseconds. So normally, I mean, depending on your application, but the application that I'm dealing with has got a timeout for interacting with the API. So that timeout, which is set on the backend, is 30 seconds. So I would probably use the same timeout value in my test, which is 30 seconds. So that's one of the things. I wouldn't set global timeout just yet. I don't want people to, whatever configuration you do, you're basically setting constraints for your framework. So if you are very lenient with it, people who are your colleagues, your beautiful friends who work with you every day, they might be tempted on becoming lenient when they are writing code. So I try, when I'm writing a new framework, I make sure that I'm using a configuration which is very strict, and then I relax the bits as we go on. Because if you start from the relaxed state, people might just write the code because it's working fine and they would push it, and code reviews these days are just a green tick, so I wouldn't bet on that. So yeah, that is one thing I would say. Don't define timeouts in the test code. Do it in the configuration like I showed you, like whatever the timeout is. So we can look at other timeouts. So there's a whole documentation on how you can specify an expect timeout, how you can specify test timeouts, what's the default one. So for default, expect is 5 seconds, for test is 30 seconds, and you can always update these timers based on how your test framework is behaving. Maybe your front-end application needs to load faster. Again, it depends. So like if you sum up, once you have the test framework, like when you do an npm init, make sure you enable the web server, make sure you set the expect timeout, and make sure you have got, if you're dealing with multi-regions, I would also suggest having a locale, which is in test use. So test configuration, test use options, here you can specify locale. So I would bring locale and locales in, and this would go in the use section. So use here. So this can be passed through the CI as well as a variable. Color scheme is your own feature. Time zone, I think it would be beneficial if you're multi-region, but again, it depends on your application. And if you have got ENGB, make sure that this is not Europe, Paris. It is something that reflects the same bit. So let's try to find. So if you want geolocation, you can do this. So your front-end application looks for users geolocation, and then it automatically figures out what page it should show them. So in my case, I would do geolocation as well. Let's look for the time zone options. So where can I find time zone Europe? So you could potentially have like Europe, London over there. And if I just try, so what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to find the strings for the time zones. So you might have a better idea of like what's the current one. I think I saw it on Wiki, like you can have I mean, London is not in Europe anymore. So what's the time zone list? I think this is it. So if I search for London, so London is Europe, London. Or you could have GB. So I'm gonna just use GB here and see if that works. So we have made a few changes to this test configuration. Let's try to run the test and see if that works. I'm not gonna go in much detail. This is like play it yourself and see what you get up to. You have the link to the documentation, which is playwright.dev/docs/test configuration. It's not rocket science, to be honest. It completely depends on what you want to do with it. So let's try to run this particular one, and px playwright test. So it is running the test, and looks like all the 6 tests passed after I made changes to the configuration. So it seems to be working. Let me try to write some gibberish and see if it still passes, or if it complains about it. So it does complain about something, and it says the complaint is ID gibberish. So invalid time zone ID. So if you enter a wrong time zone ID, it will complain. So this is a good document for time zone list, where you can find all the time zones and pick the one that is suitable for you. I wouldn't write Europe, London, just because of obvious reasons. GB is more suitable. So GB, when you're using ENGB, use GB. So it is like correct configuration. So don't just blindly copy paste. All right, so I'm gonna leave you over there. Hope you enjoyed. So that's all, folks. This was my last video about Playwright that would cover the basic parts of the Playwright course. So you have covered the getting started, where I talk about how to set up a basic framework, the writing of the test, code generation, the debugging modes, how to use fixtures, how to do page object model, annotations, and test configuration. So this is a beginner's level course which contained 8 videos. It has got everything you need to know everything from beginner level about Playwright. In my next course, I would be talking about how you build a framework and how do you deploy that framework on a pipeline. So make sure you stay tuned and keep watching. Thank you so much.